Good morning and welcome everyone to the 26th meeting of the Education and Skills Committee in 2019. Can I remind everyone present to turn their mobile phones and other devices to silent for the duration of the meeting. Our first item of business today is the final evidence session on the committee's STEM in Early Years Education inquiry. Before we begin taking evidence, can I take this opportunity to thank everyone who participated in our seminar at the Scottish Learning Festival and shared their valuable views and experiences on STEM in early years education. The write-up of the session is in the background papers for today's meeting. Today we have two panels. Our first panel has representatives from the General Teaching Council for Scotland, and can welcome to the meeting Ken Muir, Chief Executive, and Charlene Simpson, Senior Education Officer, Initial Education and Accreditation, General Teaching Council for Scotland. A very warm welcome to you both. Can I ask Mr Muir to make some opening remarks?
Thank you, Convener. The General Teaching Council for Scotland touches base with the STEM agenda in a number of areas. The first is our accreditation of the initial teacher education programmes, which we require to do before they go live, and there are a number of STEM-related programmes that we've accredited in recent years. We also touch on the STEM agenda through the work that we do on supporting teachers' professional learning, and the requirement for teachers to have their professional learning signed off every 5 years by GTC Scotland. The entry memorandum is something that committee members will be aware has been recently updated and revised, and we obviously had a lot of consideration around what was included within that entry memorandum. We have a statutory function in setting the standards for teachers, and that also is something that's under revision at the moment, and consultation started just this week, lasting until the 20th of December. And we've taken the opportunity within that to refresh the standards to take account of various policy areas, including STEM. And we also support STEM-related activities through our engagement with STEM-related groups, the Board for the Digital Strategy, for example, participation on the advisory group for the Scottish Schools Education Research Council. So a number of areas in which we touch base directly with the STEM agenda.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move to questions from the panel. I'll open with Mr Gray.
Thanks very much. Good morning to the panel. I wanted to ask, I suppose this is really two different questions, but they're kind of similar. The committee has asked a number of witnesses around the possibility of raising the entry requirement for having studied science subjects oneself, particularly for primary teachers, people entering training for primary teaching, and in a similar vein, the possibility of more time being spent in initial teacher education around building confidence in delivering lessons to do with STEM. And I suppose quite a lot of the evidence we've had back is that there's a limit to how much you can put into either of those requirements, given time and the requirement to recruit enough teachers who meet the standards. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about your thoughts around that balance, whether there's any scope at all for raising those standards in time.
It was certainly an issue that we considered when we were refreshing the entry memorandum for teachers entering the teaching profession in Scotland. There was a very widespread consultation with the various stakeholders who have an interest in entry into the teaching profession. I think there was a view that science itself, given that it is an important area, we gave consideration to some of the requests that came in, interestingly from the Royal Society and not supported by other stakeholders with whom we engaged at the possibility of introducing the requirement for science. But you point out, Mr Gray, the tension that in introducing that higher expectation around science, then there's the likelihood at the time when we are short of teachers in Scotland that we're likely to dissuade a number of folk who do not meet that requirement to come into the teaching profession. So the decision was taken on the basis of the evidence that we gathered, and Charlene was responsible for the memorandum consultation. The decision was taken to maintain the requirement for a higher in English and a National 5 in mathematics. But what we did do in the entry memorandum was to make the recommendation to universities, because we only set the minimum standard for entry. It's for the universities then to decide if they want to enhance that in any way. But we did include within the entry memorandum a statement that encouraged a modern language to accord with the government's policy in 1+2 languages, and equally potentially a science subject as well. But that was as far as we went. And when you look across the other teaching councils across the world, Scotland is not too dissimilar in terms of what its expectations are. There are none that we have looked at that require a science specifically, although in Queensland in Australia there is a requirement that they have, I think the term was confidence in science, at an appropriate level for entry into primary education. It is interesting that one or two jurisdictions, Ireland most notably as of this year, have introduced a requirement for higher maths as well as a higher in English. But I think the feeling was, from the evidence that we gathered in the entry memorandum, that what we had just now in terms of requiring a higher English and maths and recommending a science and or a modern language was consistent with the evidence that we took back from that consultation. What about initial teacher education and the potential for more time being spent in there then to build that confidence? Again, I think this is Charlene's area, but I think you've pointed out yourself the tension that we face, because there are quite a number of representations made to the General Teaching Council for subjects to be given priority, and very strong rationales been given for that. I mean, in the last few months alone, we've had representation from modern languages to introduce a higher as a requirement into teacher education. The Royal Society, the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, just the other day they were making a very strong case for geography to be mandatory as an entry qualification, given the profile of global warming and climate change and so on. So I think there are a lot of areas in which that rationale can be made. The difficulty or the tension is how much you can embed within an initial teacher education programme, particularly the postgraduate programme, the one-year postgraduate programme. And again, we've had lots of representation from various parties who would like to see more within that programme. And although we talk about it being a postgraduate year, in fact it's 36 weeks, 18 of which are spent in the university and 18 of which are spent on placement. So I think we need to look, and I know that Scottish Government are already looking at the way in which the teacher education programmes and the induction into the teaching profession has been considered. Teacher induction scheme currently, as you'll be aware, lasts for a year. Is there a way in which that adequately prepares students coming in as teachers to deal with the range of requirements that are expected of them? So I think that tension very much exists as to what you can then create the space to introduce within an ITE programme.
Yeah, I mean, I concur with everything that Ken said. Obviously, within the memorandum, we spoke to lots of people, lots of different stakeholders. We had a working group. We did 14 sessions with various stakeholders across Scotland. We had a full 12-week consultation period. And through all of that, it was only the Royal Society who actually raised the issue of the science. Everybody else was content with the expectation of science or modern languages, so that we have generalists in primary education. So in that case, we've credited lots of programmes recently, especially primary programmes. There's 6 programmes that we've credited recently. Some have a STEM focus. and some are generalists. So I could give you a couple of examples, like the new, well, it's a re-accreditation of the Strathclyde, University of Strathclyde programme. They have personalisation choice within the programme that allows students to choose a STEM pathway and other pathways, but STEM is one of them. The BA at Stirling University also has a STEM focus. You can come out with enhanced science. And the Glasgow University, the Dumfries campus, also has pathways in environmental science and mathematics. So there are options should students choose to come out with a specialism in science, but again, primary teachers teach the breadth of the curriculum, so they have to have knowledge of the whole curriculum. But there are specialised routes should they choose.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms Smith.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions, Mr Muir, but just before I ask these, could I just get a bit of clarification about something you said in your response to Mr Gray, namely that when a representation was made to you about the possibility of primary teachers having to have a higher maths, you said that when you had discussed this and looked at some evidence, you didn't feel that was necessary. Could you just expand what that evidence was?
Well, I'll maybe pass it on to Charlene, who did the analysis of the evidence, if that's okay, Ms Smith.
Yep, thank you.
When we did the consultation, obviously we looked at the Making Maths Count report, and part of they had talked about in a level 6 mathematics, but again the consideration was, does having a level 6 mathematics make you a better numeracy teacher? Because it's numeracy we're talking about in primary education. And then also, if we change the National 5 to higher maths, we had representations from other subjects like social subjects and expressive arts, saying that would be a real barrier for teachers coming with a higher mathematics.
As in significant barrier in terms of numbers not coming into the profession?
Yeah, according to the data we gathered, yeah.
Okay. Mr Muir, this issue about STEM, I think, has flagged up issues about the balance within the curriculum, and you rightly say that there are tensions over this. I mean, if you look at the uptake on SQA subjects, there are clearly issues in some aspects of STEM. There are issues about modern languages, which you just referred to, and there are issues in some social sciences, which I think the geographers have been speaking to you about. Do you feel that the GTC has a responsibility to look at the balance of the three faculties, as it were, the sciences, social sciences and arts, in advising the government about what is required, both in terms of education, but obviously from a social and economic perspective for Scotland?
Yes, and I think our role in accrediting the initial teacher education programmes is paramount in that regard. And I think we need to remember that looking at early years up to the end of P4, what we're looking to try and create in Scotland through initial teacher education programmes are teachers, primary teachers, who are able to integrate the learning across a range of subject areas and curriculum areas. And that's become more apparent as teachers in early years and early primary stages are moving towards a more kind of active learning, play-based approach to learning. And the way in which learning takes place for these young people is principally through teachers, good teaching, making connections across the curriculum areas. So I don't think we can make any apology for the fact that we're expecting those teachers in early stages of primary to be generalists who are skilled in making the links so that children understand the learning, because at that age in particular, and arguably later on, you know, they don't learn in a kind of subject context. Where they learn best is where links are made across curriculum areas, and that's why in initial teacher education we would expect any programme, and when we accredit those programmes, particularly the primary programmes, we're looking at a balance that reflects the kind of broad general nature of education that's delivered through CFE.
That's very helpful. Does that include not just within the teacher education programme, that balance, but are you looking for young recruits into the teaching profession who have a balance across the curriculum with their own qualifications from their school careers and from college and university? Are you looking for that as well? Or do you believe that you can get the balance simply through the teacher education programme?
I think, as I said, Ms Smith, our role is to set a minimum expectation for entry into the teaching profession. And we've done that with the revised memorandum. The universities then interview the students themselves to determine their suitability for coming into the teaching profession. And in a sense, we are setting broad parameters within which we expect them to operate. So whilst we have a role, the detail of what a student might bring is really in the hands of the university. And we recognise that there are difficulties in attracting teachers into some subject areas. I would imagine that the universities are very mindful of that when it comes to interviewing students, some of who might have a particular science bent or a particular social subjects bent or a creative and aesthetic bent when it comes to the interviewing of them.
Can I just finish off by asking on that point, are you aware of any trends of a downturn in numbers applying to do teacher training from any specific discipline? Does that come into your...
Well, I mean, the workforce planning group that looks at entry into the teaching profession by allocating places through the funding council to the universities, I mean, over a number of years, the STEM subjects have rarely, if ever, achieved the full complement, but equally in Scotland, we don't satisfy the complement of places that's available for the likes of home economics, for Gaelic, sometimes from year to year, English as well. So it makes that exercise of bringing folk into the teaching profession that much more difficult. I mean, what we've found within GTC Scotland is that we're having to look at new routes that don't attract teachers in the traditional sense of coming from school, going to university and then doing teacher education and then going back into schools. A lot of the new routes have been designed to try and attract folk who perhaps wish to change their career, or indeed folk who are getting towards the end of their career, who might want to finish off by offering 3 or 5 years into the teaching profession. So quite a lot of our focus most recently has been in addressing that changing model of the type of individual who wants to come into the teaching profession. It's no longer the case, as traditionally was the case in my days, and I dare say in your own, where the vast majority of teachers were those who came in from school, went to university and went to a college of education. That's no longer the model, and we've had to adapt our programmes to take account of that.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr Johnson.
Thank you. I was just wanting to ask a couple of brief supplementaries. First of all, strikes me that there's a distinction here between what teachers teach and then how they teach. In a sense, IT is attempting to deal with both. When it comes to science, is that a useful distinction, first of all? And secondly, are there particular considerations in terms of how science is taught compared to other subjects which require a separate focus within ITE?
If you don't mind, I'll turn to Charlene, because Charlene herself is a previous science teacher and she's had experience of teaching in both secondary and in primary, so she's perhaps best placed to respond to that, Mr Johnson.
Thanks, Ken. I think you're right. Content and sort of teaching and learning are kind of not distinct, they absolutely overlapped and they absolutely are interdependent. I think within the early years when you're teaching science, it's more about the methodology of science. It's developing that curiosity in children and taking them to through really good questioning and offering opportunities to use senses, and it's that observation and thinking about how are children seeing the world and how can we capture that curiosity, that imagination and build it into scientific methodology. So it's not about can you do a science experiment and what does that mean? It's actually about the love of science and conjuring up the imagery of, you know, science doesn't solve problems, but you can ask lots and lots of questions. And when I was teaching myself, we had a cluster approach to science, so we supported our primary colleagues in teaching science across the curriculum. Either they came to high school and we did work with the teachers, or we went to the primary schools and worked with the children and the teachers. So I think that sharing of pedagogy across and teaching and learning across sectors is really helpful. But I think in science, the thing is to capture awe and wonder, if you like, and the curiosity in children.
I think that absolutely chimes with what my understanding, and indeed, I think just based on what Ken Muir was saying earlier about it being a kind of a broad approach that's integrated within an approach to teaching. So, and again, if you look at the kind of E's and O's within Curriculum for Excellence, you know, certainly I'm struck by it's very much that the approach to science is about exploring the physical world. So given that, is that integrated approach of kind of physical exploration and then maybe a bit of reflective thought upon that, is that, you know, being taken forward within IT programs, and are you confident that is being carried out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the programmes that we've accredited, particularly those for early primary, are very much aligned with that kind of approach to learning and teaching, a kind of inquiry-based approach, particularly in the early years of primary. As I suggested earlier, you know, at that stage, children do not learn in discrete subject contexts. Their learning is a combination of coverage of different contexts driven by skilled teachers who are able to integrate that kind of learning. So in terms of the question you asked, Mr Johnson, about the what, it's not teaching science specifically. As I said, it's about a wider kind of connected learning, if you like, and the principle of covering science at that stage is very much, as Charlene says, about trying to develop a love for learning and an inquiry kind of approach to learning. So the programmes that we've accredited in the universities that cover the primary, I mean, we're quite confident through the accreditation panel activities that we engage with universities in, that's the kind of approach that they're trying to develop within these programmes.
Thank you.
Okay. Ms Mackay.
Thank you. Yes, just to follow up on that subject of integrated learning, at the Learning Festival last week that some members of the committee attended, we discovered that there seemed to be a lot of the problems stemmed from teachers not having confidence, usually primary teachers, in actually teaching the subject. And there was a lecturer from, I think it was Strathclyde University, but a lecturer anyway, who spoke out and said she would be very keen to reach out and, you know, have some kind of, form some kind of association so that they could, you know, help out basically and just work in collaboration. Is that something that you would, you know, that you would support, or?
Absolutely, and as I said in my introductory statement, I mean, one of the roles of the General Teaching Council is to actively support the professional learning of teachers. Every 5 years, teachers are required to have their professional learning signed off by GTC Scotland. We expect them to log their professional learning, the learning that gives the greatest impact either to them or to their students. And it's not just science that some teachers lack confidence in. There are other areas, modern languages and so on. And as Charlene suggested, I mean, one of the approaches that many primary schools take is to bring someone from secondary who has got a degree of expertise in some of those areas into the primary in order to support primary teachers. We know from the experience of 1+2 languages in the past that teachers in primary who develop a particular skill in a curriculum area or indeed a subject area become a very valuable asset, and when it comes to promotion they can build up a degree of expertise but then are moved on to another school because of that expertise. So I think what we're trying to do within GTC Scotland when we're accrediting these teacher education programmes is make sure that all teachers have got that generalist expertise, albeit in some cases relatively small scale expertise. But what we're encouraging through professional learning is the award of professional recognition to teachers who engage in meaningful inquiry and research into their own subject area or their own particular area of interest. And in the last few years, I mean, we have accredited and given professional recognition to 159 primary teachers in STEM alone. So we're trying to encourage and promote, incentivise professional learning, not just in the STEM subjects, but across the board, so that it encourages primary teachers to gain a degree of expertise, so that their practice itself can be supported, but they can support other teachers as well within their school.
And you would see further education as having a role in that, further education establishments?
I think to some extent, I mean, I think one of the areas that we explored some time ago was the programmes that the Open University made available free on their website for primary teachers who wanted to gain expertise in a particular curriculum area. I think it's more down to the role of head teachers in primary schools, ensuring that there's an adequate coverage of expertise and actively encouraging teachers as part of their professional learning to engage and be more focused perhaps in some areas, so that the school itself can benefit from having expertise across the board. But as I say, and Charlene's a good example, you know, in some areas where there still is a lack of confidence in, for example, sciences, then there are other routes that they can access that expertise from.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Ms Gilruth.
I'd like to return to, I think, Ian Gray's line of questioning at the start, which was with regard to subject specialisms, and you spoke at the start, Ken, about the requirement for Nat 5 Maths, higher English, which has always been the case, and you alluded to modern languages. I think you said there was an encouragement that they would be, was the use of the words?
Sciences,
yeah.
You know, that we actively encourage the universities to look at entry requirements around those areas as well. But it's not something that we specify.
Yeah. So you'll know where my professional interest comes as a former modern studies teacher. So I just wondered then, reflecting upon, I think it was the 2012 Curriculum Impact Report, which Education Scotland published, I think maybe about 7 years ago when you and I were there. And you'll remember that report said that 20% of secondary schools in Scotland didn't deliver modern studies. And it also highlighted that lack of confidence in primary teachers to deliver that part of the CFE, I guess, within the kind of BGE at primary level in social studies, and Rona Mackay alluded to that from last week's SLF meeting. I wonder, therefore, if you had any representations from the Modern Studies Association in terms of looking how that could be delivered within primary education.
Yeah, and I know that, I mean, Modern Studies Association, the Scottish Association of Teachers of History and the Scottish Geography Teachers Association have all been working with primary schools in order to provide resources and support in their particular curriculum areas. I mean, I think what we are finding is that that is an area that primary teachers sometimes find quite difficult to deal with, the whole modern studies, politics kind of area. It can be quite sensitive. Where do you draw the line in terms of your own political allegiances and you know, bias then coming into what you might then deliver? Again, I think it's a good example of what I suggested earlier in the context of science, that you know, not all schools have modern studies, as you are well aware, and there's historical reasons for that. But from my experience as a former education advisor in your local authority, you know, I've found that very often where there's been any concern expressed in delivering some of the E's and O's that are more modern studies and politically related, that the primary schools will not be short in accessing expertise from the secondary school. And I think it's a good example of what I was saying at the very beginning. You know, there are lots of potential claims for priority in the curriculum, and you know, folk can make as good a case for modern studies being a mandatory subject perhaps as science. Personally, as a former geographer, I would go along with the Royal Scottish Geographical Society's expectations that everybody undertakes geography. But I think I think what we're finding is, and from my experience as a former HMI, you know, these primary schools where they are lacking expertise more generally are quick to seek support, either through professional organisations like Modern Studies Association or Geography Teachers Association, or through access to a learning community, which is much more the norm of secondary schools working with a cluster of primary schools and sharing resources. And potentially there's an answer to some of this through the creation of the Regional Improvement Collaboratives. Young though they may be, you know, I'm certainly aware of a greater willingness to create to use the resources that are available within a wider collaboration to benefit the teachers and ultimately the children in primary schools.
Yeah, and in terms of those accredited programmes, though, Charlene, I think you alluded to there being accredited programmes for science specifically. Are there any that look at, you know, political literacy, for example, for primary teachers or modern studies, I guess, more generally?
Again, it's across the board. We're looking for a balanced curriculum. It just so happens that the ones that I highlighted have STEM roots. However, we're always looking for a balance across the curriculum. So we're always looking for opportunities for humanities study as well as, you know, science study. Or we need lots of primary teachers who are differently skilled or specialised in areas, so they can support each other. So we do look for that. There aren't any programmes specifically for social sciences, like there are some that are targeting STEM, but they were targeted because that came from the funding.
Yeah.
But we do absolutely look for a broad range across all curricular areas through IT accreditation.
Okay. Can I just move on then to look at professional update just now? Ken, you spoke about professional update at the start of the session, which came in 2014, and that idea that, you know, every 5 years teachers now have to get their CPD signed off by the GTCS. I just wondered if you could share with the committee this morning a wee bit about how that's quality assured by the GTCS every 5 years.
Before we undertake professional update 5 years ago, we validated all of the professional review and development schemes that local authorities had. Now, in fairness, they were of mixed quality, and what we tried to do through that validation was to set a kind of minimum standard. Authorities have responded to that, and in order to keep that up and to give a degree of quality assurance to it, we're about to embark on a programme of re-accreditation of these professional review and development schemes. So, as a starter, before professional update came in, we did a widespread validation exercise across all of the local authorities and all of the organisations that have got registrants within them. So, for example, in the independent sector, we validated either the individual private schools' PRD programmes, or SCIS themselves developed a single one that covered most of them, the Scottish Council for Independent Schools. So that has been very much our approach, has been to ensure that there is a minimum threshold of expectation as to the quality of the PRD schemes. How they're then implemented, of course, is another matter, but every year since we've introduced the requirement for professional update to be signed off, and there's usually somewhere between about 12,000 and 15,000 teachers a year have their professional learning signed off through professional update. One of the things that we've done is we've done an evaluation of the impact of professional update, and we've just recently published a 4-year report, and we're just working on the 5th year because this is the last year of the first full round. So by the end of this last academic session, all teachers in Scotland will have had their professional update signed off by GTC. One of the heartening things, I think, from it is that one of the questions that we ask within the analysis is to what extent has your professional learning and professional update had a direct impact on you as a teacher, your colleagues, the school and the students. And now this is a random sample. I mean, teachers volunteered to respond to this. Out of the 12,000, 15,000, we get about a 10% response rate. So we're not coercing folk into responding. And it's quite a positive response rate given that it's entirely voluntary. And I think I've certainly been very heartened. I know that GTC's council has been very heartened that for all 4 of those areas, the respondents who have either agreed strongly or have agreed with that statement that it's had a direct impact on them, their students, the school or their colleagues, the figures are well over 80%. In the case of individual teachers and on students, the impact has been over 95%. Now, I think that gives a fairly clear indication that of 2 things. One, that teachers are taking their professional learning seriously, and secondly, that professional learning is having a discernible impact out there on the system.
Okay, and in terms of that, though, I guess the practicalities of what happens every 5 years, it's up to the individual principal teacher or faculty head in a secondary school, for example, to sit down with their member of staff and go through their PRD. Then every 5 years, your organisation comes in And what do you do then? Do you look at what's been done? You don't check that that has been done, or are you checking? What are you looking for as evidence?
Yeah, we don't have the resource for that, and effectively the system we have piggybacks on the local authorities and the organisation's professional review and development scheme. So it would be for someone like you as a principal teacher signing off my professional learning as a member of your department. So you, as a leader of learning in the role of a faculty head or a principal teacher or a deputy or a head, have that expectation that you will sign off or ensure that the professional learning that's taking place is meaningful to the context within which you're teaching. So what we do simply is accept that the sign-off that's done by the reviewer of the teacher is good and is acceptable. So our quality assurance of that is partly through our analysis of the annual report and what we gather from respondents to that, and also through the validation of the professional review and development schemes that we have, which is why we're about, as I say, to engage in a second round of that after 5 years to make sure that the local authorities and others who are responsible for professional review and development are keeping the standard up in terms of that expectation that we all have of professional learning.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Ms Harris.
Well, I really wanted to ask you that I know about interdisciplinary learning. In the committee in June, I asked a panel about STEAM and whether the arts should be included within STEM. And the panel did consist of a mixture of practitioners, academics, and I found their responses quite positive. And really what I wanted to ask you was, have you done any research into the merits of including the arts more formally with the STEM learning?
Do you want to do that?
At this point, no, we haven't. Obviously, STEAM's been around for as long as STEM, and there's different people think arts should be included or shouldn't be included. I mean, you could argue either way. The arts, obviously, there are lots of connections between arts and sciences. So absolutely, it has a point, but we haven't done any research to this date.
Is it something that perhaps you would maybe be looking at going forward?
Yeah, I think we're always open to these kind of suggestions. I think we open up the possibility, and it's not to denigrate the arts in any way whatsoever, but it opens up the possibility to a much longer acronym which includes all of the curriculum areas in Scottish education. But you know, we've had representations from arts-based bodies at the time of the inquiry into the entry memorandum, again making very strong cases for including the arts, and particularly drama, it has to be said, within the mandatory requirements for teachers coming into primary education. As I say, we're working very closely with instrumental music instructors who, again, you know, make a very strong case for music being part of the curriculum, and therefore having an expertise in those who are coming into the teaching profession to be able to respond to that. So it's certainly something we're open to, and you know, we're quite happy that we take that forward through our own education committee.
Right, okay, thank you.
Dr Allen.
Thank you very much. I was interested in hearing about career law and professional learning and your views about how that's developing, specifically with regard to STEM around the country, and the role of the GTCS in trying to evaluate that. So I wonder if you could give a picture of whether you feel that CLPL and STEM is improving around the country. I appreciate you're not inspectors in that respect, and I know you've mentioned some of the voluntary surveys you've done, but can you say a little bit more about how that might be measured?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way in which we've tried to frame the professional standards in Scotland is quite unique. The standards for registration set a benchmark for teacher competence and student competence. Following on from that, the standard for career-long professional learning and the standards for leadership and management are really designed to try and provide teachers with opportunities to use them as a kind of toolkit to plan their professional learning. So it's interesting in the feedback that we had from our analysis of the 4 years of professional learning that most teachers, or the highest proportion of teachers, responded to having used the standard for career-long professional learning to inform where they might take their career and where they might take their professional learning. We ourselves don't record the areas within which teachers undertake the professional learning. That's something that's the responsibility of teachers aligned with whoever it is that is the reviewer within the school. But as I said earlier, we know from the responses that we've had to requests for teachers to be considered for professional recognition awards that we're seeing an increase in the number of teachers who are coming forward seeking professional recognition with the General Teaching Council for Scotland. And I think the other thing I would point to is that within our website we have a research hub. And one of the things that Charlene has been responsible for over the last few years has been to try and encourage teachers to engage in meaningful but small-scale research, stuff that they might do themselves or do in collaboration with groups. And we then put that onto our website and onto this research hub that allow teachers to access that. And in areas of technology, in mathematics, in numeracy and so on, we're seeing an increasing number of teachers providing that kind of support to colleagues in the STEM area. So I would say that overall, although we don't measure it as in a kind of hard quantitative way, I think the qualitative evidence would suggest that the incidence of professional learning in STEM is increasing.
And the professional update that you have is used to monitor some of those things, but how do you make sure that there's for any given individual teacher throughout their career, there is this ongoing contact, this ongoing opportunity? Do you see, for instance, regional varieties in how those opportunities are taken up, or is there any basis on which you can measure that?
Not specifically. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the professional learning of teachers is effectively a contract between the teacher and their reviewer. And again, we would expect teachers to have a different kind of profile of professional learning dependent on the skills that they have or perhaps don't have, the kind of context, the school within which, and the area within which they're teaching. So I can't say that we've got specific evidence on that, other than to go back to what I said earlier, Dr. Allen, which is that we are seeing through the kind of qualitative feedback that we're getting and the ways in which we measure in a very loose way the response to professional update, that STEM subjects are increasing in profile in that area. And I think what has added to that, and perhaps has been a catalyst for it, has been the fact that the STEM strategy is something that we expect through the professional standards that head teachers will drive forward, along with other major policy priority areas. So,
well, one area that anecdotally that teachers have brought to us on one of the occasions recently that we've been meeting them is specifically a feeling that they don't have much, they don't know where to begin when it comes to engineering specifically within the STEM spectrum of subjects and subject areas. Is that something that you try to overcome or try to address directly?
Well, I'll maybe pass that one on to Charlene, but it is an area where we have had quite an active involvement, and particularly with the Primary Engineering Organisation, or Primary Engineer, I think it's called.
The engineering, primary engineering, we have been working with them to promote their programme, which starts again in January, and we have been working with them to put an article in our magazine, and we've put it in our newsletter so registrants know that this is available. So we try as far as possible to use as many of our social media channels to actually show opportunities for professional learning, not just engineering, but STEM and other things as well. Being from a STEM background, on Twitter I use Geek Girls and all the STEM things. That's the things that I retweet because they're things that are close to my heart. But so we're trying really hard to support, and we supported the UWS STEM Academy as well. And again, we're using that as almost a springboard to support teachers to say there are opportunities out here. Go have a look. These are things. So we're pointing to things rather than, obviously, we're not providers of professional learning.
Can I just pick up? I think that's an important point, that through the Teaching Scotland magazine, which goes free 5 times a year to all registrants and indeed all members of this committee, I believe, we have a section on resources which covers physical resources and staff development, professional learning opportunities. And one of the pieces of work that we're doing on behalf of Scottish Government is creating a national e-portfolio, which is a kind of portal through which teachers can both record their professional learning, but the added value development to that is that they can also access professional learning opportunities. So things like the work that primary engineering do would feature within that particular portal.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I could just ask a supplementary question. By invitation, I've been able to attend a couple of the STEM Academy events at UWS, and I know that's a partnership with other universities such as St Andrews and Edinburgh and Glasgow as well. And to see the Royal College of Chemistry involved as a partner in delivering that, absolutely fabulous 2 days of intensive training. When I was there, it was open to people studying their PDGE, people who were probationers, 6-year pupils who were thinking of going into teaching or had a mission to go into primary teaching. And it's just from my understanding, it was done on a voluntary basis for everybody attending. How does that effort on their behalf, if you like, feed into their professional standing and that accreditation? Or does it in any way? Is it recognised?
It could be recognised should they choose it to be through professional recognition on an individual basis, but that's only open to teachers who've been teaching for a couple of years. Right. However, if they are student teachers or if they are prospective teachers, then again, it's about that enthusiasm for science and trying to develop that sort of curiosity, that methodology.
Mm-hmm. Just from a layman's terms, I was absolutely inspired by what I was seeing going on in those events. If we could move to Mr Greer.
Thanks, Convener. Throughout this inquiry, the committee's taken a substantial amount of evidence around gender inequalities in STEM, which would be of no surprise and is unfortunately nothing new. I'd be interested in your perspective on what the role of the GTCS is in tackling gender inequalities, both in empowering teachers to tackle them where they see them in the classroom, but also supporting teachers to work through any unconscious biases that they might have.
It's an area that we have updated both the professional code and the professional standards in. There are now very specific references within the exemplification of the values, particularly under social justice, within the new refreshed professional standards, an expectation that teachers challenge the kind of assumptions and are aware of conscious and unconscious bias. Also within the professional code, there's specific references to teachers needing to be aware of and actively engaging in discussion and dialogue around what would constitute conscious and unconscious bias. So we've tried very hard to update the both the professional standards and the professional code, and as I say, they're out for consultation at the moment, so you will be able to see within that specific references to what teachers are expected to do as professionals in the context of bias and both conscious and unconscious.
How does that materialise within ITE at the moment? If I were on an ITE course, what would the GTCS's expectation be of that course in relation to tackling gender inequalities? Not just in STEM, but STEM is where it most obviously manifests itself.
Yeah, as part of the accreditation, again, we look strongly at the value system and how values are then discussed and supported throughout the ITE programme. We don't want it to be a one-off lecture. It has to be embedded within the programme, and that's something that we are very strong about, and we want to understand how universities are discussing values and how students are then developing dispositions and values and challenging assumptions and beliefs and unconscious bias. So it is part of the ITE accreditation. And kind of just add just a little bit, we also worked with the Institute of Physics on their improving gender balance in science as well. We were part of that working group, again tackling that inequality in gender. So we supported that as well, and our PRD documentation, our new guidance, will also have sections on it which will look at ask teachers to challenge their biases.
I mean, the specific wording of that, the professional review and development guidance document that GTC has drafted will be issued at the end of October. And the advice in the summary at the end to reviewers and reviewees, and the actual wording is that they should be prepared to challenge unconscious bias and that of others. So we've tried to give it as high a profile as we can within the PRD guidance, which is applicable to all teachers, but equally to the code and the standards.
That's really useful to know. How will you measure the success of that?
In initial teacher education, we accredit the programmes as presented to us. We don't have a formal role. That formal role sits with Education Scotland and HMI specifically at committee and ministers' behest to undertake reviews of aspects of teacher education. GTC Scotland plays no role in that, although in discussions with Gail Gorman, the Chief Executive, she, like me, has recognised an inconsistency in that, in having an organisation that accredits the programmes, but then has no role specifically in monitoring the implementation of them. And Gail has given an undertaking that in any initial teacher education review that committee or ministers call for in future, GTC Scotland will be represented within it. But specifically to respond to your question, Mr Greer, what we do is we take feedback from students themselves, because we are constantly engaged with students during their undergraduate or their postgraduate year, and also from probationers. We do a lot of work with probationers who are going through not just the teacher induction scheme, but those who are going through the flexible route as well. And we have regular updates from the probation managers in each of the local authorities. So I think we've got a pretty firm handle through those means of the reaction and the response that the students and probationers are making to the programmes that they're experiencing.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms Ross?
Thanks, Convener. I've just got a really quick supplementary to the line of questioning from Ross Greer. At the Scottish Learning Festival last week, we had a workshop, and one of the teachers who was actually speaking as a parent said that her two girls had felt that STEM had been forced on them so much that they were completely against going into any careers that involve STEM. So how do we ensure that we're encouraging, I mean, hopefully that's an isolated incident, but not going too far in the opposite direction and making sure that STEM's open to everyone?
Yeah, it's disappointing that has happened. It's probably been an overzealous head teacher or staff looking at the STEM strategy. That's disappointing if that's the case. I mean, I think the way in which we do it is we try and ensure through the measures that are available to the General Teaching Council in accrediting the programmes and engaging with the students themselves, and through the work that we do on an ongoing basis with in-service teachers, that we remind them about the importance of that balance across the curriculum and the role that teachers have to play, if we take secondary, particularly in delivering well for their subject area, but also that responsibility for interdisciplinary learning, which I do think has got a greater focus in the recent refresh of the Curriculum for Excellence narrative, reminding teachers that students learn best when high quality teachers make the connections between areas of the curriculum and subject areas. And I think if we can generate that, particularly in early primary, which is the remit of the inquiry, but more generally then I think we'll have succeeded in producing well-rounded individuals who can take a decision as to where they then want to take their career, whether it's as a scientist or as a PE teacher or whoever.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think that completes question from the panel. Can I thank you both for your attendance at committee this morning? It's been very helpful. I'm going to suspend briefly for a couple of minutes to allow the panel to change over. Can we now move to our second panel of the day and welcome to the meeting Richard Lockhead, MSP, Minister for Further Education, Higher Education and Science, Barbara Morton, Team Leader for STEM, Languages and Social Subjects in the Curriculum, Niamh O'Connor, Head of Early Learning and Childcare Quality Unit, and Stuart Robb, Head of Education Workforce Unit at the Scottish Government. I'd like to invite the Minister to make an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener, and it's a pleasure to be before the committee this morning, and particularly amongst the new members who weren't here last time as before committee, and a special welcome to Beatrice Wishart, newly elected Parliament, and this is the first time our paths have crossed, so it's a pleasure to be particularly here this morning. I just want to give a few minutes to hopefully set the scene over what's a really important issue that you've chosen to investigate. I very much welcome the opportunity to appear before the committee. I want to discuss the Government's approach to STEM learning in the early years of education, and of course particularly during this Maths Week Scotland. In terms of the big picture, science and innovation are embedded in Scotland's heritage and culture. They play an ever-increasing role in Scotland's future within this very complex world in which we live. Science, technology, engineering and mathematics open up new ways of manufacturing, create new knowledge and innovation, and open doors to understanding the world around us. So that does create huge opportunities for economic growth in Scotland and for the social benefit for our people. So to achieve these benefits, we need to grow Scotland's STEM expertise. And this needs to happen for everybody, so there's equality of access and opportunity in STEM. In my time since becoming Minister for Further Education, Higher Education and Science, including STEM, I have been very impressed and inspired to see at first hand across the country the multitude of STEM opportunities and initiatives that are underway. So we all need to promote and celebrate Scotland's significant success, achievement and talent in STEM. And you as a committee are rightly focusing on the early years of education, which are the foundation of this success. So whilst there's much to be celebrated, as you're finding out, there are many, many challenges as well. For example, ensuring there are the right number of teachers and early learning professionals with the expertise to deliver great STEM learning, also to tackle the gender balance and other inequities that exist in STEM, which of course are unfair and undermine their ability to deliver inclusive economic growth, and the need to sustain and grow the inspiration and enthusiasm for STEM, and making sure that education and training is equipping people with the skills that employers seek. So the STEM strategy we've put in place aims to tackle all of these challenges in what we hope is a systematic and coordinated way. Within the course of the inquiry, you'll have heard about some of the action that we have been taking to make sure that all our children have a really good STEM experience in the crucial early years. You'll have heard about the Raising Aspirations in Science Education programme that's worked across 532 schools, school clusters since August 2017. And the evaluation shows that 87% of pupils involved enjoyed more challenge in STEM learning, and 77% had increased their STEM aspirations. You'll have also heard about the Scottish Science Education Research Centre, which we'll call CERC for the purposes of the rest of this committee meeting, that we have funded for more than 10 years. And to date, CERC's primary science cluster programmes engage with 99 school clusters across all 32 local authorities. There's a lot more we're doing. We've got the 2,700 active STEM ambassadors in Scotland. We've also got the fact that Education Scotland recently awarded nearly £1.4 million of STEM professional learning grants for teachers, technicians and early and community learning practitioners. There was a total of 140 new bids that are going to be supported, benefiting an estimated 722 establishments across the country and nearly 14,000 practitioners this year alone. I don't really want to say much more. I could go on about some of the other actions, but I'm sure you'll mention them during the questions and answers. But in conclusion, for many of the strategy's actions, particularly those targeted at early years, it will take time and patience to see the long-term impacts. I do feel confident that we have the right building blocks in place, but of course we will continue our efforts to raise aspiration in STEM and ensure that our young learners are encouraged and inspired to develop an interest and awareness of STEM, not just for their future careers, but to ensure we have a society equipped to fully understand and adapt to our ever-changing world.
Thank you very much, Minister. We'll move to questions to the committee. I'll go first to Mr Gray.
One of the things, Minister, which we've talked about quite a lot in evidence sessions, has been around continuous professional development of teachers, because that seems, I suppose, to be the area in which time pressure and so on doesn't mean that there's a restriction. But it's quite difficult to get hard information about just how much STEM CPD for primary teachers has taken place. And I just wonder if the government have looked at creating a proper performance indicator to monitor just how much CPD has been undertaken by primary school teachers, taking up the kind of opportunities that you mentioned with CERC and so on.
Thank you. Clearly, in terms of the wider debate that you have been having over ensuring that all practitioners at all levels have the confidence to teach STEM and take an interest in STEM, that's a very important question, that we have the opportunity for the professional career development. As I gave the figures in my opening remarks, the £1.4 million we have just announced, for instance, for the STEM grants from Education Scotland, they're far-reaching across many establishments across Scotland, early years and primary schools and secondary schools. So there's an appetite out there for career development. I think it would be helpful to have a better picture, because there's what the government's doing, but there's also local initiatives in each local authority area. There's initiatives through the college hubs that take place. The science centres reach out to both pupils and clearly staff as well. So I think there is a bit of work to be done. That's a fair point. We need a better picture.
So my question is, are you intending to do that bit of work?
Yes, we will be doing that, and we do have the performance indicators at the moment that are outlined in the strategy, which are quite relevant to that question. What I'm saying is, just in terms of my year in this post, is that we perhaps need to keep working to make sure we do that complete picture.
So can we take from that that after another year in post, perhaps when you're in front of the committee again, you'll be able to tell us how much CPD has been undertaken in STEM areas by primary teachers, because you'll have created that performance indicator and be monitoring it?
Hopefully that will be the case, yes.
Okay.
Okay, can we move to Ms Smith?
Thank you, Convener. In the previous panel, Mr Muir flagged up some tensions as he described them, specifically the example he gave that with requests from some interest groups that they wanted to see in the raising of standards of people entering the profession, there was some reluctance to go down that road because of the shortage of teacher numbers. Could I ask you what discussions the Scottish Government is having with local authorities about the gap in certain STEM teacher availability across the different parts of the country? What discussions are undergoing just now?
There's constant discussions with both local authorities and the universities, and I know that your previous session this morning you'll have heard about some universities taking extra steps to try and enhance the qualifications with science for teacher training in some cases. So these discussions do take place with local authorities. I'm sure Stuart Robb will come in a second because that's his area of expertise. But the point about putting extra barriers in the place of aspiring teachers is one that we have to be very conscious of, because clearly this is our committee looking at STEM, and in future we might look at another subject, and the more qualifications we ask aspiring teachers to have, clearly the more obstacles we'll put in place for applicants. So we do have to be careful about that. But I welcome the fact that some universities are taking some steps to enhance the qualification. But I'll bring Stuart Robb in about the direct conversation with local authorities.
Yes, we recognise that the recruitment of teachers and student teachers is challenging in certain subjects. The teacher workforce planning process, which includes local authorities, recognises that in terms of the targets that it sets for student intakes. We know obviously that universities find it difficult to fill those targets sometimes, so there's a range of things that we are doing to try and support that, including putting in place alternative routes into teaching, which we have a number of those, and a majority of those are focused on STEM subjects. That's involved a lot of work with the universities and with the General Teaching Council to get those courses in place. And I think we have around 770 additional teachers in the system, or students in the system, as a result of those new routes. We have put in place a STEM bursary scheme to try and encourage more students to come into STEM subjects. That offers a £20,000 bursary for career changers. And our Teaching Makes People recruitment campaign also has a particular focus on STEM subjects. So all of that is trying to enhance the numbers that we have coming into the system.
That's helpful, thank you. I'm asking the question, Minister, because when we had Education Scotland in front of us at the time we were discussing subject choice, it was very clear to this committee that they weren't terribly clear about where the gaps were in certain teacher numbers. So we had a lot of issues about that. Mr Robb has just indicated there are 170 extra teachers available having come in from that new route. Can I ask about what discussions are taking place then, specifically with universities and with the local authorities, about where these 170 teachers will be deployed in order to fill some of the gaps where we know that subject choice has dropped in STEM, or there's been a downturn in SQA uptake in certain STEM subjects?
So you're also talking about secondary school education as opposed to early years, but the universities clearly are autonomous to a degree in terms of they design their own courses, but in the wider STEM conversations we have with the universities, they take that into account, and we don't direct them to change their courses to add on the option of having an extra science qualification.
No, it's not that, Minister, so much as the fact that there are obviously potential teachers there, not just for secondary but for primary. And what I'm interested in is what ideas you have, along with local authorities and universities, for getting them into the classroom where they are badly needed. That's what I'm really driving at.
Well, I'll ask you to come back in with direct conversation with universities, but clearly local authorities have got a big role to play in this.
In terms of the teacher workforce planning process, the Teacher Workforce Planning Advisory Group sets a national target. And then following that, we work with the universities and the Scottish Funding Council to allocate those places where they're most needed. Now, obviously that's driven largely by capacity in universities, but we're working with them at the moment to try and have a more geographical element to that planning process, so that we can make sure that the student teachers and teachers are going where we need them.
Yeah, I get that. I think that's very helpful, but there's another route to go, and that's to ensure that these newly trained people are getting into the right classroom. And that's what I'm interested in, because after all, that's where the important basis will be for education, if these newly trained people are actually delivering the education that is obviously required across classrooms in Scotland, whether it's primary or secondary. And particularly focused on getting them there means a lot in terms of improving the uptake of STEM subjects, not just if they've been fired up in primary school, but as they go on to make their SQA choices. So that, it's all very well saying we've got these teachers ready to go, but the next stage is getting them into the classroom, and that's what I'm interested in, what plans the government has to do that.
Yeah, I mean that's part of an ongoing discussion with local authorities through the teacher workforce planning process. I mean, it is for local authorities to employ these teachers. We can't dictate where they go.
Absolutely, but are you aware of how many of the 170 have got offers of places?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's actually 770, not 170.
Sorry, I misheard you. Right.
Yes, we're aware of. I mean, these are all part of our alternative routes, and we work quite closely with the universities and the local authorities on those routes.
So there should be good statistics now on the numbers, the increased numbers who are being qualified and where they are in schools.
Yes.
Okay, I think we'd be interested in seeing that, if that was possible.
Sure, we can request that information. Mr Johnson.
Thank you. I was just really wanting to pick up on the point on entry requirements. We just heard from the GCS about the various calls. And I understand the point that you make about not wanting to put barriers, but when you look at what's being asked for about requiring SEQF level 5 in a science, it doesn't seem particularly onerous to me. And indeed, if we aspire to a broad education, is there a sense in which we should be aiming for all school leavers to have an SEQF level 5 qualification in a STEM subject?
Well, that takes us into a much wider debate. Well, yes, I'm sure it would address part of the problem. I think we don't dictate the curriculum to schools, as you're aware. There's a broad curriculum which the schools abide by in the education system. So it's certainly beyond my pay grade to support certain qualifications that all pupils in Scotland should have when they leave school. I think the other debate that you're having as a committee, and you've heard from witnesses, is the most important debate, which is in case of primary school and early years, it's all practitioners having the confidence to take part in STEM learning. And that is seen by many of the experts I've spoken to and heard from as the key, as opposed to going for other solutions that you're perhaps referring to. And that's where a lot of the emphasis of government policy has been, a lot of the emphasis in the STEM strategy is to ensure that all primary school teachers or early years practitioners have enough of a degree of confidence to teach STEM. And that way it's not down to certain teachers with certain qualifications, particularly in primary school level or early years. I know there's a debate we've just had about secondary school, and that's obviously a later stage. But in terms of the key period of influence in terms of inspiring an interest in STEM, which is the early years, it's seen as generalists.
In terms of ensuring that our primary school teachers have confidence in science, ensuring that as many people have taken science as far as possible in secondary education would clearly be a help. So to that extent, ensuring that we have breadth as long as possible will help this situation in terms of that general understanding and familiarity with science, would it not?
Well, I don't have a closed mind about that. I'm just making the point that the emphasis, which I do support, is on the fact that early years intervention is shown to have much more of a longer-term impact and take up of STEM careers, etc., in later life. And therefore, we have to focus how in the early years in primary school we spark the curiosity for science and mathematics, engineering, and so on. So,
Ms. Harris, did you?
I would like to ask you something that my colleague Oliver Mundell mentioned in a previous committee meeting. CERC offer training to early learning and childcare practitioners in the delivery of STEM learning in childcare settings, and obviously that's very valuable. But it's only actually available to local authority providers. So I know that obviously, your government have reiterated time and time again that the expansion to the 1140 hours of funded childcare cannot be done without the private, voluntary and independent sector being included. So in light of that, could I please ask you why they're being excluded for accessing this learning, and whether there have been any discussions to bring them into this, given that they are actually providing the same government-funded entitlement under the National Standard for Childcare in Councils?
There is clearly an issue there in terms of local authority nurseries. In this case, we're talking early years, have more access to support in some areas, and it is something I'm keen to look at, which I am looking at the moment in terms of expanding childcare. However, there is a lot happening for private providers as well as local authority providers in terms of early years. So as part of the expansion, there's an induction programme, and that takes into account STEM, and that's open to both private providers and local authority providers. And also, Education Scotland have set up online portals to make that available in terms of STEM activities and advice, which is available to private providers as well as local authority providers. And I can't speak for every private provider in Scotland, but for some I have spoken to in recent years, they are taking part in STEM activities as much as local authority providers are as well. So I'm not saying there's not an issue there, I'm just saying that there is ample opportunity for private sector providers to access STEM advice and resources through Education Scotland and other sources.
Yeah, would I be right in saying that obviously, you are funding CERC, so is there more, in relation to this, I think that there is a major issue if the private providers can't actually access the same training as local authorities. Is it something that you could move on a bit quicker? And, because 1140, it's due to be rolled out next year?
So CERC is funded by local authorities, therefore
yeah.
it's primarily there for local authorities. But Niamh is clearly dealing with this issue on a day-to-day basis, and she's dealing with private providers, so I'll bring Niamh in.
Yes, thank you. You're absolutely correct that the expansion of funded ELC, the involvement of private, voluntary and independent providers in that is crucial to the success and fundamental. And so we are very mindful of continuous professional learning being available to all sectors of early learning and childcare provision. For the specific issue of the STEM grants, for example, the Education Scotland STEM grants, they are accessible to private, voluntary and independent providers of funded ELC. And the guidance that Education Scotland issue to people considering bids into that grant make that very clear. And CERC, for example, who are one of the grant recipients in round 1 of that programme and in the latest round, that has been through a collaboration with the Scottish Childminding Association. So, part of, in one way, the private, voluntary and independent as a group of self-employed individuals. So CERC are increasingly working with PBI providers in ELC, but there is a way to go on that. And that is all in addition to the main provision for continuous professional learning through ELC, which is, as the Minister said, includes the new National Induction Resource published this year. It includes a directory of CPL opportunities that's available to all sectors and all staff, no matter what sector they work in, local authority and private, voluntary and independent. And that directory has a whole section, it's on the Care Inspectorate website, it has a whole section on STEM and resources and things that practitioners can use. And finally, there's a national programme of online CPL in development. And that again will be available to providers of funded ELC no matter what sector they are in, and that will include a specific module on STEM. And that's getting worked up at the moment, so that the committee's consideration of STEM in early years education is very timely for that, and the kind of findings from the committee can feed into the process of developing that module.
Okay, thank you.
It's also just worth mentioning that the Scottish Childminders Association have just been awarded a grant through the Education Scotland STEM grants that were just decided in the last fortnight. And that's to allow them to take forward online training courses for their members.
Good, thank you.
Dr. Allen?
Thanks very much. I was asking, and a number of us were asking the last panel with the General Teaching Council for Scotland, whether there was any kind of measure in existence as to how much STEM career-long professional learning there was out there now. And perhaps it's really more a question for the government in a way than for them. So I'm curious to know what there is out there, and whether you as a government can see any variations around the country in terms of how much it's being accessed. I'm talking about career-long education for teachers.
Clearly, we've mentioned before some of the instruments that are in place to fund that, and we do pay very close attention to issues of equality to make sure that all parts of the country are benefiting, and indeed that deprived areas and other areas of Scotland are not excluded for any particular reason. So through the many streams of activity for CPD, there should be opportunities for all practitioners in Scotland to benefit. Clearly, in some of the funding rounds, we need proactive applications, and plenty come in. It's well oversubscribed. Our STEM grants awards that are delivered through Education Scotland. So that's clearly an issue for us to keep reflecting on, is the fact that these are oversubscribed. But in terms of the most recent rounds, there are many awards for rural parts of Scotland. For instance, I've just got one here that says for North West Sutherland, the schools there, clearly one of Scotland's most rural and remote clusters of schools. They have been offered funding to allow teachers to visit each other's classrooms and learn about the most effective ways to improve numeracy and mathematics teaching. So that's just one of many types of awards that are given regularly to different parts of Scotland. As I said in response to Ian Gray, I think because there are so many different routes for CPD, that we do have to keep working and getting a complete picture for the country. It's actually a sign of success because there are so many ways in which now practitioners can access CPD that we have to just make sure we're on top of that and understand that the whole of the country is benefiting. So we do monitor it and we do have our own schemes, but I do think there's still that case for having a more complete picture.
Okay, thanks. Are we seeing any measurable, or is it too early to look for any measurable impact of all the work that's being done in CPD and primary on the broad general education phase in secondary in terms of an impact in the young people themselves and their confidence in science subjects?
We have the results of the various surveys that have taken place, which show that teachers are a lot more confident, practitioners, we're talking early years, primary and secondary, are a lot more confident at delivering STEM, and that also the children as well. So there's the survey, the STEM survey that's carried out by Education Scotland, if I remember correctly. So that does give us some data which we can pass to the committee if you don't have that already. But
And thinking of earlier on in education, in terms of preschool, in terms of early years, is there a different picture for private and state provision in terms of what's going on in terms of providing confidence and information to practitioners there?
yeah, I'll ask Steve if we've got that particular data.
Certainly. Well, in terms of how we can guarantee the level of qualification and skills and continuous professional learning of workforces in different sectors, the national standard, which will come into force from August 2020, is a key part of that, and that includes measures around minimum amounts of continuous professional learning broadly, not just including STEM, but in the round, and actions around the quality of learning of experiences of children in early learning and settings when they're at those younger ages. And that national standard applies for anyone who wants to deliver funded ELC, so local authority settings, but also private, voluntary and independent sector settings as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms Mackay.
Good morning. Yes, Minister, in July this year, you wrote to the committee to talk about the funding of an initiative to improve gender balance and equalities within STEM learning. The Tapping All Our Talents report from last year noted that gender stereotypes and biases abound in all parts of society. So I wanted to ask you whether you think primary teacher training gives sufficient attention to challenging that unconscious bias, and given that teachers are key influencers in early years, and what more could be done to progress this issue?
I'll ask colleagues to come in a second on the teacher training aspect of that, but in terms of the wider debate, there's a lot happening, and that was a very important report. And I know the report said that there's been a lot of action to follow the commitments from central government, local governments, all the various partners, but there's still, of course, significant challenges, particularly in later years. But in terms of early years and primary, we have our gender balance and equalities officers that are now being put in place across the country. So clearly they're tasked with working with all practitioners, all providers within their regions to take forward this debate. There's been various reports and resources made available to all the practitioners. There's the Gender Equal Play, which is a new resource that the Care Inspectorate, working with Zero Tolerance, put together for early years. So it's much higher up the agenda in early years and primary, and these officers have got a key role to play in taking that forward. In terms of direct teacher training, though, I think I'll have to ask colleagues. Maybe Stuart can come in and let us know if he's aware of how that's taken forward.
Yes, I mean, you'll have heard from GTC that initial teacher education is an issue for the universities to determine the content of their courses, but they will. The courses will be set up in a way which will enable teachers to meet the standard for registration, which is set by GTC, and those standards will include, substantial information on gender balance and equality issues. Now we are speaking to the universities through the Scottish Council of Deans and the General Teaching Council to just to work with them on how we can make gender issues more prominent within initial teacher education, but ultimately is a decision for the universities to make in terms of the content of courses.
And can I ask, given that there isn't a relevant KPI in terms of gender balance within STEM, how can this be measured? How, how is effectiveness or progress of it going to be measured? Is it early days, or is it, is it planned?
The strategy, of course, is only its first year of a 5-year strategy. So clearly, hopefully, in subsequent years, we'll see evidence of progress. As I said before, a lot of these issues are relatively long-term impacts. But, I visit nurseries, primary schools, secondary schools, colleges, and everywhere I go, there are references to gender balance issues, and they take into account much of the guidance and the policies that are made available to them. So I was at Seafield Nursery, Seafield Primary School in Elgin just last week, visiting there, and the practitioners were taking me through all the steps they take to ensure there's gender balance and no stereotyping of gender issues. And one of the wee girls in front of me was playing with her hard hat on and her uniform, so hopefully it's making an impact.
That's really encouraging. Is it something that should be included within school inspections, do you think? Should they focus on it more than, well, they do, I don't know if they even do it at all right now, but...
Yeah, well, again, the inspectorate, takes its own decisions about how it goes about its inspections. STEM generally is part of the inspection process. So whilst I'd be confident these kinds of issues will be incorporated to a degree, there's no prescription in terms of how the inspection process goes about it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Creer.
Just to stick with Ronan Mackay's last question there, I'm not quite clear, Minister, in the absence of a KPI on gender inequality in STEM, particularly in early years and primary, how are you measuring success? What are the measures of success the government's looking for here?
Well, Barbara will refer to the KPIs in terms of how they'll be taken forward.
Yes, so there is a KPI, as you're aware, about gender balance in STEM in terms of what we can measure from the SQA data. It's also the case that the Improving Gender Balance and Equalities programme is going to be evaluated. So that will give us indications of their effectiveness. Probably it's possible that evaluation data isn't necessarily going to be robust enough to perhaps base a very strong KPI on it, but you can be assured that the effectiveness of what that programme is doing is going to be monitored and evaluated as it grows and develops. And we will also be looking at, as the Minister says, finding other sources of evidence that we and that we can talk about in the annual reports on the strategy about how this awareness is growing. Obviously, the Improving Gender Balance and Equalities officers will have their own work programme, and there's a steering group which has been set up to help guide that work programme, so they will have their own internal programme targets, for example, in terms of the numbers of schools and practitioners that they're engaging with, and the numbers of wider STEM partners. It's important that part of the work of the officers is to work not just with schools, but also to raise awareness of gender and unconscious bias amongst all the STEM partners, say the museums, the science centres, the festivals, Skills Development Scotland, and this sitting alongside the gender action plans that colleges and universities have. It's important to see them as part of that wider context too.
That's useful, thank you. And just one brief supplementary. Are there plans to assess the impact, the success or not, of STEM projects that have been funded using the People Equity Fund? I think we've all probably got some very good, or perhaps maybe not as effective, anecdotal examples of where PEF funding has been used, particularly in primary school settings for STEM work. But I'd be interested in if there's any specific evaluation of projects that have used PEF through the work that you're doing.
Well, my understanding is that PEF has its own evaluation, so it will look at the merits of how PEF is used across Scotland, whether it's STEM or not STEM in other areas. So that will be evaluated, and clearly I would hope that we would be made aware of how many initiatives that are out there that are funded by PEF. But clearly that's a separate exercise evaluating PEF.
thanks. Probably follow that up with you once we've bottomed
Yeah.
out how PEF is being evaluated.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Ms Harris, did you want to come back in? No, you're fine. Ms Ross?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Science centres have been charged with delivering the STEM strategies approach to tackling geographical inequities in access to STEM education. But given that these are in Aberdeen, Dundee, Glasgow and Edinburgh, and are all very long bus journeys and possibly require an overnight stay for schools in my constituency, how is this addressing inequities?
So you quite rightly highlight the importance of science centres, which are to a significant extent funded by the Scottish Government. And the issue you raise is usually the first question I ask them every time I meet them, and every time we are providing a resource to them is, what are you doing to support our island communities in rural Scotland? And they do fund a number of initiatives that are going around all around Scotland. Generation Science and various outreach programmes they have. They bring back to us the evaluation and the statistics relating to their activities around Scotland. So they are reaching all corners of the country. I visited my constituency, well actually it wasn't my constituency, I have to correct the record. I visited Buckie, which is in Murray Council local authority area, but not in my constituency. I visited a Generation Science performance there that was organised, I think it's Edinburgh Science, if not it's Glasgow. And so I've discussed directly that issue with all the science centres. So there is evidence we can send to committee about the number of outreach visits undertaken by each science centre, and also the number of practitioners and pupils that they have had contact with around the country.
That'd be very helpful, thank you.
In terms of the extra costs, there are funds available through certain funding streams to pay for bus journeys for pupils and transport costs. So I'd happily send that information to you as well.
Do individual schools have to apply for that on a case-by-case basis, or how is that distributed?
So that's a good question. Again, because of the success of bringing forward so many initiatives in the last few years, I am keen to make sure it's easy for all schools and establishments to access what's out there. But we have the RAISE officers that work in each local authority, and part of their job is to coordinate and make sure that preschool, primary schools, secondary schools know what's available and coordinate it all. Also the college hubs as well, which they work through. And we've got the team who work for Education Scotland also, the STEM officers, but that's more one per region. Although in rural areas, to recognise the extra challenges facing rural areas, there's more than one STEM officer in, I think it's the Highlands and maybe one other region of Scotland. So there's 8 officers across 6 regions to give extra support to rural areas.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Beatrice.
Yeah, could I follow up, Minister, on the question that Gail Ross has raised and about access for island communities, and pupils just can't get a bus to Aberdeen or Dundee. So it's just a question of how that plays in and with the island proofing as well, and to ensure that the access is available for island communities as well as rural.
Absolutely. That's, again, relating to the last question, something that's very much a priority for myself. Clearly, I represent a rural constituency, not an island constituency, but I represent a rural constituency. So, again, we discuss with all the science centres who do a lot of the outreach work that they are paying attention to island communities. And when we send information back about the visits, etc., the committee will see that. But also the grants and the applications that come in from local authorities or from practitioners. Shetland applies for some of those grants as well. So, clearly we do our best to make sure the whole of the country benefits from our grants and awards as well. and I'll happily send members details of how their own areas have benefited.
Thank you.
Mr. Gray? Yeah.
Well, up there, Minister, you mentioned there the funding of STEM coordinators in some parts of Scotland, and I think I'm right in saying, colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong, that we did take evidence from the STEM coordinator in Highlands and Islands Council, but she pointed out that the funding for her post was coming to an end and there was no prospect that she knew of that continuing. So I just wonder what you intend to do to try and make sure that that continues.
Yeah, I will investigate that. I think that was raise officers. So you've got two types of officers. You've got the ones that are funded jointly by Scottish Government and the Wood Foundation, the raise officers, and they work embedded in local authorities. And then you've got the STEM officers who work for Education Scotland.
I think it was the raise, yeah.
Yeah, and they're allocated per region. So that's a good resource that we have there. I'll happily check the situation in the Highlands and understand what's happening. My understanding is that the posts are continuing, but I'll have to understand the context of her comment to the committee.
Okay. Minister, this is our last opportunity to take evidence on this inquiry, and we decided to undertake this inquiry in the context of the fourth industrial revolution, and as you said, about the skills for the future. So it's just really, with so much work going on and so much development work going on, how will we measure success in this area, and are you confident everything that's happening is going to lead to that workforce that's fit for those new challenges?
How will we measure success? Well, clearly, ultimately one of the purposes of Education Scotland is to ensure we have appropriate skills for the workforce and for the economy of the future. And we know that the fourth industrial revolution and the fast changing economy, not just in Scotland but globally, is even more dependent on STEM skills than ever before. And the number of jobs in Scotland relating to STEM skills is on the increase. So clearly our measure for success in the longer term will be to what extent the skills are available there for the economy. In terms of the short to medium term, many of the issues we've discussed today, clearly we have to monitor and evaluate, make sure we are attracting more teachers into STEM subjects, that we are ensuring that STEM is being taught at all levels of education to an appropriate level, and that the teachers and the practitioners have the confidence to do that, and we will continue that effort.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you to the panel for attendance at committee this morning. We will moving straight into suspend for a few minutes to let the panel leave. Thank you. Move to agenda item 2, which is European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. We are considering a proposal by the Scottish Government to consent to the UK Government legislating using powers under the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018 in relation to a UK statutory instrument proposal. The relevant statutory instrument is the EU Research and Development Programme's Revocation EU Exit Regulations 2019. Do members have any comments on this notification? Thank you, and that concludes our public session for this week. Next week we will take evidence on the Disclosure Scotland Bill, and now suspend and move into private session, and we'll have a 5-minute break.